The Whispering Walls. Sarah and Tom had been dreaming of owning a home together for years. They were young, excited, and eager to start the next chapter of their lives. When they found the house, it felt like fate. The small, charming home was tucked away on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by tall trees that swayed gently in the wind. It had everything they wanted: wooden floors that creaked slightly underfoot, a cozy stone fireplace for cold nights, and a quaint little garden where they could imagine themselves sipping coffee on quiet mornings. To Sarah, it felt like the perfect place to build a life. "It's got so much character," she said, running her fingers over the rough stone mantel above the fireplace. Tom agreed. The house had an old-world charm, the kind of warmth that made it feel alive. They made an offer immediately, and to their surprise, it was accepted quickly. In less than a month, they had packed up their apartment and moved into their dream home. Their first night in the house, started off wonderfully. They had unpacked just enough to make the living room comfortable. The fireplace crackled as they sat together, sipping wine and talking about all the things they planned to do with their new space. But later, as the fire died down and the house grew quiet, Sarah noticed something strange. A faint whispering sound seemed to float through the air. At first, she thought it was her imagination. Maybe it was the wind brushing against the old wooden walls or the trees outside. But as she listened more closely, the whispers seemed distinct, almost like voices. Words like "leave" and "not safe" sent a chill down her spine. "Tom, do you hear that?" she asked, turning to him. Tom paused, listening, but shook his head. "It's probably just the house settling. Old houses make weird noises," he said with a reassuring smile. Sarah nodded, trying to brush off her unease. But as they went to bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Scratches on the wall. A week later, Sarah noticed something even more unsettling. On the bedroom wall, just beside their bed, were faint scratches. They weren't there before, and they looked like they had been made by nails. Sarah ran her fingers over them, frowning. "Tom, did you see these?" she asked, pointing to the marks. Tom stepped closer, inspecting the wall. "That's weird. I didn't notice them before," he said. "Maybe the paint's peeling or something." "These don't look like peeling paint," Sarah replied, her voice tinged with worry. To put her mind at ease, Tom suggested they repaint the wall. The next day, they spent the afternoon covering the scratches with fresh paint. It looked good as new, and for a moment, Sarah felt relieved. But when they woke up the following morning, the scratches were back, even deeper this time. The whispers grew louder as the days passed. The strange occurrences became harder to ignore. The whispers Sarah had heard on the first night seemed to grow louder. At first, they only came at night, but soon she began hearing them during the day too. Whenever the house was quiet, the whispers filled the air. "I swear I'm not imagining this," Sarah told Tom one evening. "The voices, they're saying things. They're warning us." Tom tried to stay rational. "It's an old house, Sarah. Old houses make noises, and you've been stressed with the move. Maybe it's just your mind playing tricks on you. But Sarah wasn't convinced. The whispers were too clear, too real. And she wasn't the only one noticing strange things. Late at night, they both started hearing the sound of footsteps. The creaking floorboards made it seem as though someone was walking through the house. Yet every time Tom got up to check, he found nothing. Mysterious movements then. Objects in the house began to move. They would wake up to find chairs slightly shifted, books knocked over, or picture frames tilted on the walls. One morning, Sarah found a vase that had been sitting on the dining table shattered on the floor. Maybe it fell, Tom suggested, though his voice sounded unsure. It wasn't anywhere near the edge, Sarah said. Her fear was growing, and she could see that Tom was starting to feel it too, even if he didn't want to admit it. The ice-cold breeze one evening, Tom had to work late, leaving Sarah alone in the house. She tried to keep herself busy, watching TV and scrolling through her phone. But as the night stretched on, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Around 10 p.m., she felt a sudden, icy breeze sweep through the living room. She checked the windows and doors, but everything was closed. Then the lights began to flicker, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The whispers grew louder, turning into angry, unintelligible voices. Sarah froze, too scared to move. She clutched her phone tightly, her heart pounding. Suddenly, one of the lamps in the corner of the room fell over with a loud crash. That was enough to send her running. She grabbed her coat and ran out of the house, waiting in the car until Tom came home. Seeking answers the next day, Sarah and Tom decided they couldn't ignore the strange happenings any longer. They reached out to a local historian to learn more about the house. The historian, an older man named Mr. Clark, was hesitant at first, but eventually agreed to meet with them. He told them the house had a dark past. Decades ago, it had belonged to a man named Arthur Graves, who was rumored to practice dark rituals. According to local stories, Arthur had tried to summon spirits and harness their power. No one knows exactly what happened, Mr. Clark said, his voice low. But ever since, families who've lived there haven't stayed long. They all reported strange, unexplainable events. Some claimed to hear whispers, others saw things move on their own. A few even said they felt something watching them. The final straw. Armed with this knowledge, Sarah and Tom tried to stay calm, but the activity in the house only got worse. The whispers turned into loud, angry voices that seemed to echo through the walls. The footsteps became more frequent, and objects were moved daily. They barely slept, constantly on edge. One night, Sarah woke up to find deep scratches running across the foot of their bed. It was the final straw. "We can't stay here," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We have to leave." Tom didn't argue. He had tried to stay rational, but even he couldn't deny what was happening. They decided to sell the house and move back into their old apartment. But to their shock, no one was interested in buying the property. Rumors about the house's dark history had spread, and potential buyers were scared off. Abandoning the house with no other options, Sarah and Tom packed up their belongings and left. They abandoned the house, leaving their dream home to the whispers and shadows that seemed to haunt it. As they drove away, Sarah glanced back one last time. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing in the window, watching them leave. She turned away quickly, her heart pounding. From that day on, they never spoke of the house again. It remained empty, a forgotten relic of their past. But sometimes, late at night, Sarah would wake up with the faintest memory of whispers echoing in her mind. And she wondered if the house was truly behind them, or if it would haunt them forever. The shadow in the apartment Emily had always dreamed of living on her own. The hustle and bustle of the city called to her, promising excitement, independence, and endless opportunities. So, when she found a small but charming apartment right in the heart of downtown, she jumped at the chance. It was affordable, which she found surprising given the location, but she didn't want to overthink it. She signed the lease and moved in within days, feeling a rush of excitement as she carried boxes up to her new home. The apartment was on the 4th floor of an old brick building. It had a cozy feel, with warm wooden floors, a tiny kitchen, and large windows that let in plenty of sunlight during the day. Emily loved it immediately. She spent her first week arranging furniture, hanging curtains, and adding her own personal touches. Her friends visited, bringing housewarming gifts and helping her set up. They joked about the apartment's creaky floors and slightly dim lighting, but Emily brushed it off. It gave the place character. The first few weeks in her new home were uneventful. Emily quickly settled into a routine. She went to work during the day and spent her evenings cooking, reading, or watching her favorite shows. She felt proud of her little space and enjoyed the sense of freedom that came with living alone. Life seemed perfect. But one night, everything changed. Emily woke up suddenly, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't explain why, but she felt uneasy. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She scanned the room, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. There was nothing unusual. Telling herself it was just a bad dream, she pulled the covers over her head and eventually fell back asleep. Over the next few days, the feeling persisted. During the day, everything felt normal. But at night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the sensation that she wasn't alone. She started noticing small, strange occurrences. Lights would flicker on and off without explanation. Objects seemed to move from their original spots. At first, she thought she was simply misremembering where she had placed things. But when her keys, which she always left on the kitchen counter, appeared on the coffee table across the room, she began to feel uneasy. One evening, while she was watching TV, something caught her eye. A shadow moved across the wall, quick and silent. Emily froze. She glanced around the room, but nothing was there. She tried to convince herself it was just the headlights of a passing car or her imagination playing tricks on her. But deep down, she felt a growing sense of dread. As the days turned into weeks, the shadow became more frequent. It was never clear or solid, but always lingering, just out of focus. Emily would catch glimpses of it in the corner of her eye, only for it to vanish the moment she turned her head. It seemed to follow her, always staying in the periphery of her vision. She began to feel a constant weight of unease, as though she were being watched at all times. Emily decided to tell her friends about what she was experiencing. They laughed it off, teasing her about watching too many horror movies. "It's probably just stress from moving," one of them suggested. Another joked, "Maybe your apartment's haunted." Though they meant well, their reactions left Emily feeling even more isolated. She stopped bringing it up and kept her fears to herself. One night, determined to confront whatever was happening, Emily set up her phone to record while she slept. She placed it on her nightstand, aiming the camera toward her bed. It took her a long time to fall asleep, her mind racing with questions and fears. When she finally drifted off, her sleep was restless and filled with unsettling dreams. The next morning, Emily woke up early and immediately grabbed her phone. Her hands trembled as she pressed play. At first, the footage showed nothing unusual. She watched herself toss and turn in bed, the room bathed in the soft glow of her nightlight. But then, around 3 a.m., something appeared. A dark, human-like shadow emerged in the corner of the frame. It didn't move like a person. It seemed to shift and glide, almost as if it were floating. The shadow grew closer to the bed and stood at the foot of it for hours, unmoving. Emily's heart raced as she watched the shadow dissolve into the darkness just before dawn. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. It wasn't her imagination. Something was in her apartment. Terrified, Emily called her landlord. She needed answers. When he picked up, she tried to stay calm as she asked if anything unusual had happened in the apartment before she moved in. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, he admitted that a previous tenant had died in the apartment. The death was ruled a suicide, but there were rumors of foul play. He quickly added that nothing strange had ever been reported by other tenants. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't know what to do. She couldn't stay in the apartment, but moving wasn't easy or cheap. She spent the rest of the day packing up her belongings, unable to stay another night in the place she once loved. Within a week, she found a temporary place to stay with a friend and moved out. Even after leaving, Emily couldn't escape the memories of the shadow. She refused to talk about it, afraid that even mentioning it might bring it back. Whenever her friends asked why she left such a nice apartment, she would just shrug and change the subject. To this day, the experience remains a secret she keeps locked away, a haunting memory she hopes to forget. The breathing basement. Mark and Lisa had been dreaming about buying their first home for years. They had saved up every spare penny, combed through countless listings, and spent many weekends visiting open houses. Finally, they found a place that felt perfect. It was an older home with charm and character. It had a spacious backyard where they imagined hosting barbecues and a large basement that Mark planned to turn into a game room. The possibilities seemed endless, and they couldn't wait to make it their own. When they first toured the house, Lisa felt a little off about the basement. It was a large, dimly lit space with concrete walls and a low ceiling. She couldn't put her finger on why it unsettled her, but the air felt different down there. It wasn't just cold, it was heavy, like something was pressing down on her chest. She mentioned it to Mark, but he brushed it off. "It's just an old house," he said with a laugh. "We'll clean it up, and it'll be perfect." Despite her uneasiness, Lisa agreed to move forward with the purchase. After all, the rest of the house was lovely. They quickly settled in, unpacking their boxes and making the space their own. Mark wasted no time starting his basement projects. He was excited to create a cozy space where they could play pool, watch movies, and entertain friends. But as Mark began working in the basement, strange things started happening. At first, it was small, almost unnoticeable things. He would hear faint noises, a soft creak, a distant whisper, or what sounded like footsteps overhead. He chalked it up to the house settling or his imagination running wild. But the sounds didn't stop. In fact, they grew louder and more distinct. One evening, while Mark was measuring for new shelves, he heard a clear, sharp knock on the wall behind him. He froze, holding his breath as he listened. There was no one else in the basement, and Lisa was upstairs cooking dinner. He shook his head, trying to convince himself it was nothing, and went back to work. But then it happened again, a knock, louder this time, followed by a low, groaning sound. Mark couldn't explain it, but he felt like someone was watching him. When he told Lisa about it later, she frowned. "Maybe it's the pipes or something," she suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. The truth was, Lisa still felt uneasy about the basement. She avoided going down there whenever possible, and when she did, the heavy feeling in the air made her want to leave as quickly as she could. As weeks went by, the noises became harder to ignore. Mark started joking that the house had a personality and liked to play tricks on them. Lisa didn't find it funny. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong with the basement, something they couldn't see. Then, one night, things took a terrifying turn. Lisa was upstairs reading a book when she heard a loud crash from the basement. She jumped up and ran to the top of the stairs, calling out to Mark. He didn't respond. Panic surged through her as she raced down the stairs, her heart pounding. When she reached the bottom, she found Mark standing in the middle of the room, staring at the floor. His tools were scattered everywhere, as if someone had thrown them across the room. The shelves he had been building were tipped over, and the air was freezing cold. "What happened?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling. Mark turned to her, his face pale. I don't know, he said. I heard a crash, and when I turned around, everything was like this. Lisa felt a chill run down her spine. Let's go back upstairs, she said, grabbing his arm. That night, neither of them could sleep. Mark tried to come up with logical explanations for what had happened. Maybe the shelves weren't balanced properly and they fell over on their own. Maybe he had bumped into something without realizing it. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. The next day, Lisa suggested they call someone to bless the house. Mark hesitated at first, but after some convincing, he agreed. They contacted a local priest who came over a few days later. The priest walked through the house, sprinkling holy water and saying prayers. When he reached the basement, he stopped at the door and refused to go any further. This space is tainted, he said, his voice grim. I can bless the rest of the house, but whatever is in the basement does not want to leave. He advised them to leave the house as soon as possible. Mark and Lisa were stunned. They had hoped the blessing would bring them peace of mind, but instead, it only confirmed their fears. Determined to find answers, they decided to look into the history of the house. They visited the local library and searched through old records. What they discovered left them shaken. The previous owner of the house had been a reclusive man who lived alone for many years. Neighbors described him as strange and obsessed with the occult. He spent most of his time in the basement, conducting rituals and experiments that no one fully understood. After his death, the house sat vacant for a long time. Several families tried to move in, but none of them stayed for more than a few months. Rumors of strange noises and unexplained events had plagued the property for decades. Mark and Lisa didn't know what to do. They had put everything they had into this house. It was supposed to be their dream home, but it was quickly turning into a nightmare. They tried to ignore the strange occurrences and go about their lives, but the activity only escalated. One morning, Lisa woke up with scratches on her arms. They were thin and red, as if someone had dragged sharp nails across her skin. She had no memory of how they got there. Mark tried to reassure her, but the next night, the same thing happened to him. That was the breaking point for both of them. Within days, they packed up their belongings and left the house. It was a heartbreaking decision, but they knew they couldn't stay. The basement and whatever was in it had driven them away. They moved into a small apartment across town and tried to put the experience behind them. But the memory of the house lingered, a dark shadow over what should have been a happy time in their lives. Mark and Lisa never spoke of it again, but they both knew they would never forget the basement that breathed. The haunting of apartment 13 Jake was thrilled when he found an affordable apartment in a busy part of the city. It was hard to find such a good deal, especially for a place that looked so nice. The building was old, but in great shape, and apartment 13, his new home, was spacious and filled with natural light. The windows let in a warm glow during the day, and the high ceilings made the apartment feel even bigger. Jake couldn't believe his luck. At first, everything seemed perfect. He loved his new place and the convenience of living in the heart of the city. He spent the first week decorating, arranging his furniture, and making the apartment feel like home. The neighbors were quiet, and the building seemed peaceful. Jake was happy to finally have a space he could call his own. However, things started to feel a little strange not long after he moved in. It began with small, odd occurrences. One morning, Jake woke up to find the kitchen cupboard doors wide open, even though he was sure he had closed them the night before. He shrugged it off, thinking he might have just forgotten. Then, a few days later, he heard a soft thud from the living room while he was in his bedroom. When he went to check, he found that a picture frame had fallen off the shelf. He chalked it up to vibrations from the street outside and moved on. But the strange events kept happening. Doors would creak open on their own, even when they had been securely closed. Sometimes, Jake would hear faint footsteps in the hallway, but no one was there. Once, while watching TV, he felt a cold breeze pass by, even though all the windows were shut. At first, Jake wasn't scared. He found it a little amusing and even joked to his friends that he had a ghost roommate. They laughed it off, telling him it was probably just the quirks of an old building. Things started to get more unsettling after a few weeks. Late one night, as Jake was getting ready for bed, he heard the sound of laughter. It was soft, high-pitched, and unmistakably that of a child. The sound sent chills down his spine. He checked the hallway outside his apartment, but it was empty. He even peeked out the window to see if the sound was coming from the street below, but everything was quiet. Jake told himself it must have been his imagination or maybe a sound from a nearby apartment. The laughter wasn't the last strange sound he heard. A few nights later, he woke up to the sound of faint whispers. It was as if someone was speaking just outside his bedroom door. Jake froze, his heart racing. When he gathered the courage to check, he found nothing. The hallway was empty, and his apartment was still. But the feeling of being watched lingered. One evening, Jake discovered something that made him question everything. After taking a shower, he noticed a small handprint on the fogged-up bathroom mirror. It was too small to be his, and he had been alone in the apartment. He wiped it away, trying to stay calm, but he couldn't shake the eerie feeling. The next morning, he found the handprint again, even though he had cleaned the mirror the night before. This time, he took a picture of it to show his friends. They were just as baffled as he was. Jake decided to talk to his neighbors to see if anyone else had experienced anything strange. Most of them were polite but avoided the topic. They seemed uncomfortable when he mentioned apartment 13. Finally, an elderly woman who lived on the first floor pulled him aside. She told him that many years ago, a young child had died in apartment 13 under mysterious circumstances. The details were unclear, but ever since, people who lived there reported unusual activity. Hearing this made Jake's stomach churn. He tried to convince himself that there had to be a logical explanation for everything. But the more he thought about it, the more the pieces seemed to fit together. The laughter, the footsteps, the handprint, it all pointed to something he couldn't explain. Determined to find answers, Jake decided to set up cameras around the apartment. He placed them in the living room, the hallway, and his bedroom. He wanted to see if he could catch anything unusual on video. The first night, he didn't notice much. But when he reviewed the footage, his blood ran cold. One camera had captured a door slamming shut on its own. Another showed the lights flickering, even though Jake hadn't touched the switch. The most chilling clip was from the hallway camera. It showed a faint, shadowy figure of a child standing at the end of the hall. The figure lingered for a few seconds before disappearing. Jake showed the footage to his friends, hoping they could offer some explanation. Some suggested it was a prank or a trick of the light, but others were genuinely concerned. One friend suggested using sage to cleanse the apartment, a practice believed to remove negative energy. Jake was skeptical, but willing to try anything. He bought a bundle of sage and followed the instructions he found online. He walked through the apartment, letting the smoke fill each room while he said a prayer for peace. For a moment, it seemed to work. The apartment felt lighter, and the strange occurrences stopped. Jake began to relax, thinking the worst was over. But the peace didn't last. Within a week, the activity returned, and it was more intense than before. The laughter turned into cries, echoing through the apartment at all hours. Objects didn't just fall off shelves. They flew across the room. Jake started having vivid nightmares of a child calling out for help. In the dreams, he would wander through a dark, endless version of his apartment, searching for the source of the cries, but never finding it. One night, Jake woke up to the sound of his bedroom door creaking open. He sat up in bed, his heart pounding, and saw a small figure standing in the doorway. It looked like a child, but its features were blurred and shadowy. Jake froze, unable to move or speak. After a few seconds, the figure disappeared, and the room was silent again. Jake spent the rest of the night with the lights on, too terrified to sleep. The next morning, Jake made up his mind. He couldn't stay in apartment 13 any longer. He packed his belongings, taking only what he could carry, and left. He didn't even bother to find a new place first. He just wanted to get out. Jake moved in with a friend temporarily, leaving most of his furniture and possessions behind. He couldn't bear the thought of going back to the apartment to retrieve them. After moving out, Jake tried to put the experience behind him. But the memories stayed with him, and he often wondered about the child who had once lived there. He never found out the full story, but he hoped that, wherever they were, they had found peace. Jake never spoke of the apartment again, and he made a promise to himself to never live in a place with a reputation like Apartment 13's. Some things, he realized, were better left alone. The haunted mirror when Mia and her 3 closest friends, Lily, Jake, and Emma, moved into their first shared house. They were filled with excitement. It was an old house with creaky wooden floors, tall windows, and a slightly eerie charm, but they loved it. To celebrate, they decided to throw a housewarming party. They spent the whole week cleaning, unpacking, and decorating to make the space feel like home. The party was a big success. Friends and family showed up with smiles, food, and thoughtful gifts. The group laughed, danced, and enjoyed their new space. Among the pile of gifts was a large antique mirror that Mia's best friend, Sarah, had found at a thrift store. "I thought it would look perfect in your living room," Sarah said with a grin as she handed Mia the gift. The mirror was stunning. Its gold frame was intricately designed with carvings of vines and flowers, giving it an old-world charm. "Wow, it's beautiful," Mia said, genuinely impressed. She decided it would look perfect above the fireplace in the living room. After the party, she and Jake carefully hung the mirror, admiring how it brought the whole room together. However, the moment the mirror went up, strange things started happening. It began subtly. Mia's usually friendly cat, Whiskers, refused to go anywhere near the living room. He hissed and arched his back whenever he caught sight of the mirror, something he'd never done before. At first, Mia brushed it off as her cat being fussy, but it was just the beginning. A few nights later, as Mia sat alone in the living room, scrolling through her phone, she thought she saw something move in the corner of her eye. She glanced up at the mirror and froze. In its reflection, she could see the room clearly, but there was a dark shadow in the corner that wasn't actually there when she turned around to look. She told herself it was just a trick of the light and tried to shake off the eerie feeling. But the strange occurrences didn't stop. Every time Mia walked past the mirror, she felt like something was watching her. Shadows appeared and disappeared in its reflection. One time, as she stood brushing her hair in front of it, she saw a figure standing behind her. She spun around quickly, but the room was empty. She told her friends about it, hoping they would take her seriously. But Jake laughed it off. "You've been watching too many scary movies," he teased. Emma and Lily were more sympathetic, but agreed it was probably Mia's imagination playing tricks on her. Still, Mia couldn't shake the unease that settled in her chest whenever she looked at the mirror. Things escalated a week later. One night, Mia woke up to a loud crash coming from the living room. Heart pounding, she rushed downstairs and found the mirror lying face down on the floor. Strangely, it was completely intact, not even a scratch on the glass or the frame. "That's impossible," Mia whispered to herself. The mirror had been securely hung on the wall, and there was no wind or movement that could have caused it to fall. The next morning, Mia decided to investigate. She called Sarah and asked if she knew anything about where the mirror came from. Sarah admitted she'd found it at a small, dusty thrift shop that specialized in antiques. Curious, Mia decided to do some digging. She searched online for anything she could find about antique mirrors and strange occurrences, eventually tracing the mirror back to an estate sale. The house it came from had a grim history. Decades ago, it had been the site of several violent deaths, and locals whispered that it was cursed. People who had lived there reported experiencing paranormal activity, Mia's heart sank as she read these accounts. She couldn't ignore the similarities between those stories and her own experiences. Determined to get rid of the mirror, Mia told her friends about what she'd found. "We need to get rid of it," she said firmly. Jake, still skeptical, shrugged. "If it makes you feel better, sure," he said. The group carried the mirror outside and left it by the curb for trash collection. The next morning, Mia's blood ran cold. The mirror was back in the living room, hanging in its usual spot as if it had never been moved. "This isn't funny," she said, accusing her friends of playing a prank. But their confused and slightly scared faces told her they had nothing to do with it. Mia tried again. This time, she and Jake drove the mirror to a landfill several miles away. They watched as workers threw it into the pile of trash. Relieved, Mia returned home, but her relief was short-lived. The next day, the mirror was back, spotless and hanging in its usual place. Mia's hands trembled as she stared at it. Desperation took hold. Mia tried to smash the mirror with a hammer, but no matter how hard she hit, the glass wouldn't crack. The strange occurrences in the house grew worse. Doors slammed shut on their own. Lights flickered constantly, and Mia began experiencing terrifying episodes of sleep paralysis. She would wake up in the middle of the night, unable to move, with the overwhelming feeling that someone was watching her. Her friends, now just as scared as Mia, agreed something had to be done. Lily suggested they call a paranormal expert. Reluctantly, Mia agreed. They found a local expert named Mr. Collins, who had years of experience dealing with haunted objects. When he arrived, he immediately sensed the dark energy in the house. Mr. Collins examined the mirror and confirmed their worst fears. "This mirror is acting as a gateway," he explained. "It's a conduit for a malevolent spirit." He assured the group that he could perform a cleansing ritual to banish the entity. The ritual was intense. Mr. Collins lit candles, burned sage, and chanted prayers in a language Mia didn't understand. The atmosphere in the house felt heavy, and at one point, the mirror began to shake violently. Shadows danced across the walls, and the room grew cold. Finally, with a loud shattering noise, the energy in the house shifted. The mirror remained intact, but the oppressive feeling was gone. "The entity is gone," Mr. Collins said, wiping sweat from his brow. He advised Mia to dispose of the mirror properly by burying it far from the house. Following his instructions, Mia and her friends drove to a remote area outside the city. They dug a deep hole and buried the mirror, covering it with heavy stones to ensure it wouldn't surface again. As they stood there in the quiet night, Mia felt a sense of relief for the first time in weeks. Back at home, the house felt lighter, as if a dark cloud had been lifted. The strange occurrences stopped, and Mia finally slept peacefully. She vowed never to accept antiques as gifts again, no matter how beautiful they seemed. The experience had taught her that some things are better left in the past, where they belong. Although life returned to normal, Mia couldn't help but wonder about the mirror. Was it truly gone? Or would it find its way back to another unsuspecting owner? She hoped, for everyone's sake, that it would stay buried forever.